This is a 1978 K5 Blazer. It was brought to me by a friend of mine who picked it up about a year ago, and he's since had a bunch of work done on it. Obviously, it got an entirely new paint job, new wheels and tires, the undercarriage and frame got dealt with, the interior is looking good, but he's just not happy with how it's driving. There's a disconnect sometimes, I think, between how much money you spend on something and your expectations of where that money's going. And quite honestly, I think too many people focus on getting these things looking good and ignore the major mechanical shortcomings that need to be addressed to make this thing drive the way it looks. So today, I'm gonna put this thing up on the rack. We're gonna crawl through the steering, the suspension, the transmission, brakes, engine, interior, and I'm just gonna make observations or recommendations to this guy as to what I think he should address first to make it handle better, make it stop better, make it turn better, and make it just drive better overall. Remember, this is a almost 40-plus-year-old truck. You can throw a bunch of money at the paint and the interior, but it's still gonna drive like a 40-year-old truck until you address a bunch of stuff that we're gonna get into today. So let's get this thing on the rack and take a look underneath. We're gonna take this thing on a test drive now. What I'm gonna be looking for is just how it drives. Is there any strange pulling one way or the other, whether off the brakes or on the brakes? Does it shift smoothly? Does reverse work? Does park work? What's the power like? Are there any strange noises? Do I have a pull severely in one direction or the other? How's the ride? Is it smooth? Is it bumpy? Are there noticeable rattles? All that kind of stuff. So let's fire this thing up. It started right up after the first time. Reverse. Okay, so far so good. I hope we're not as low on gas as it says we are. I'll chalk that up to the gas gauge not working. How about that? Steering feels nice. Power steering is working well. Very light feel. Oil pressure is not working. Voltmeter is working. Let's see if we've got a speedo. Okay, the speedometer is not working, which is interesting because I did see the VSS hooked up. So I am guessing that it's not hooked up to the dash. Steering is a little all over the place. This feels like there could be an alignment issue, like there's not enough toe, because it tends to want to move on me right now. Lots of little corrections. That also could be the steering stabilizer is bad. Feels solid. It does feel pretty good. Brakes work. Nothing too terrible so far. This thing's driving pretty well. So let's take a look at this guy before we get it up in the air. Clean, straight, beautiful. Really like what he's done with this. I love the fact that it's kind of staying period correct. I think those rims and wheels look awesome. Nice ride height for a sweet daily driver. I'd like to see a roll cage going on here because I know this guy has kids. I don't think your kids should be in the back seat without a roll cage. But yeah, look at this stance. This front end is beautiful. One of my favorite front clips right there. Let's take a look at this interior. Pretty standard. Doesn't look like there's been a whole lot of money thrown at the interior yet, despite stereo upgrades and floor upgrades. Let's pop the hood. These springs put a lot of leverage, and you'll find that it will start to pucker. So I'm gonna recommend that we extend this, put a reinforcement piece all the way up along here. But let's take a look inside. First thing, he's got no AC, no nothing. It's got the old school original small block. Looks like he's got a Edelbrock carb on there. Nothing too surprising in here. Electrical looks decent. Fan shroud. His wipers aren't hooked up, but then again, he doesn't have any wipers per se. Man, there is really not much on these frames, is there? They are pretty bare bones. I'm not sure what's going on here. This has all been electrical taped, but despite being a very, very clean example of Squarebody, this truck has a lot of stock and original components on it, and that's what I want to focus in on. While it looks good, there's a lot of stuff that can be improved and upgraded, and I think these improvements and upgrades, they're going to apply whether you've got brand new paint or not. So if your truck doesn't look like this, if the frame is a little rusty and the body panels are a little dented, this will apply regardless. Steering, suspension, brakes, they're all the same, and upgrading them can make a huge difference in how your Squarebody performs. So starting at the front end of this Blazer, the first thing I notice is we've got a very basic setup. There is not a whole lot changed. We've got a traditional 10-bolt up front. We do have a lift kit, and this appears to be based on this 2x2 square tube block that's extending the bump stop down. I'm thinking we're looking at about a 2-inch lift. My first concern is with this 2-inch lift, there is no drop pitman arm. So right off the bat, we're gonna have some challenging steering, especially under articulation. But let's take a look at the rest of the front end, and it's a very typical front end for one of these trucks. It does look like the body bushings have been replaced, although this one is loose. And how does this one look? This one is loose too. Bushings in the sway bar are pretty thrashed. I'm seeing a common theme here. A lot of the bushings need to be replaced. These bushings look good, but they look to be the wrong size. And all these rod ends look to be pretty old. So my first assessment, just looking at it, is this is a clean, straight Blazer. There hasn't been a lot of molestation to the frame or a ton of abuse. It's got a basic lift kit on it. It's mostly stock. And the easy, low-hanging fruit to make this thing drive better are pretty obvious. Fix the steering, get a drop pitman arm, maybe a 2 or 4-inch drop pitman arm. Go to crossover steering, which is going to take this drag link right here and move the drag link from the pitman arm. It will now traverse across to a steering arm over on the passenger side knuckle. That's going to get rid of all this stuff. You're going to have a much better pull across the axle. Don't know the status of this shock for the steering, so we'll look into that. But bushing replacement, custom springs, replace the old Rancho shocks that never really work no matter what you do. Steering box replacement, there's a bolt missing on this steering box right here. Steering box reinforcement, I should say. And yeah, that's about it. I mean, it's fairly standard, fairly traditional, fairly typical. but all the bushings are shot, which is most likely why this thing is wandering all over the road when you drive it. This is the factory steering box, and it is notorious for tearing away from the frame. So this is a hydraulic box. You've got ports coming in off the power steering pump. This is your sector shaft that comes out of the box that turns and will move your pitman arm. As your pitman arm moves, it's going to obviously move your drag link. It's fixated to the frame. And so there is a lot of force trying to pull the steering box off the frame, which leads to cracks around the mounting bolts, which he's actually missing a couple on here. So that's a little concerning. One up there, he's missing one. That's in. One bolt from what I can see. While the frame doesn't look too bad, I really want to pop this steering box off and take a look at what we're dealing with. Off-Road Design makes a frame plating kit that we're going to throw on that reinforces this so that you're never going to have any worries. I also see that despite having a little bit of a lift, he's still got the stock pitman arm. So what you can see is the pitman arm is flat, and so your drag link is at these crazy angles. And with all the stuff that's going on with the linkages here and the old rod ends, that's a recipe for disaster. So let's take a look at the inside of the frame here. Let me grab a light and see what we can see inside. I do see some suspect areas that might be cracked, but not the worst I've seen, which is a good indication that this truck was not abused. I'm not saying that if you see cracks, your frame was abused. I'm just saying that the fact that I'm not seeing any tells me that this thing has not been beat on that bad. But this does concern me. The way that the pitman arm is still stock, despite having a little bit of a lift, what seems to be about a 3-4 inch lift, is a red flag. If you're in your driveway and you just want to see, make sure that all your knuckles and bushings are still good. As you are jacking up the truck and the front tire gets up into the air, watch that front tire. If that front tire shifts at all when it becomes unweighted, that can be indicative of bad ball joints. Other way to test is once you get it up in the air, and just give it a little wobble. That one looks good. That one looks good. Roll the wheels. Those track good. Let's lock the hubs if we can. Okay. There's one locked. There's two. Open diff. But locking hubs are working. There we go. So the locking hubs are working. There's no plaint in the ball joints. The only other thing I see looking under here right now is the factory shocks, or the aftermarket shocks. I've got a tip on what shocks to go with. It's not these. If this is helpful, if you are finding this entertaining, or even if you hate it, please consider giving me a subscribe. The more subscribers I get, the cooler my kids think I am. Let's check his drive lines. The angles look good. There's no binding here at full droop, which is good to see. There hasn't been a drop kit put on the transfer case, which is nice. Sometimes the transfer case will get dropped down to accommodate a new driveline angle. It's a temporary fix. About 3-inch blocks in here. Normal factory springs. All the bushings and the springs, once again, are just thrashed. Let's check these body mounts, see how these look. New body mounts, and they are tight. Any damage or weird things on the frame that I can see? Nothing. The exhaust is mounted well. Yeah, once again, it's got these shocks. These emulsion shocks that you see, these are incredibly popular. You can get these from Rancho, you get them from Pro Comp, you get them from everyone. And they're horrible. They don't work. You'll pull them off and they're probably already shot. I recommend going to the monotube Bilstein 5125s. It's a great shock, it's reasonably priced, they last a long time. They're basically just a single monotube, so it's a true shock. It's not an emulsion where you've got a piston and fluid outside. Much better setup. So we obviously have a very clean example of a K5 Blazer. And I'm well aware that if you pick up a Blazer, it's most likely not going to look like this. This guy has put some money into this, getting it to look the way it does. He's just been unhappy with just the rough edges, how it drives, how it steers, how it stops, and just how it handles on the road. And so my recommendations to him would most likely be the same recommendations I would have to you if you have just bought a Blazer. Take a look at the steering box. It's advisable, if you're going to be doing anything significant, to reinforce that steering frame, the frame where the steering box mounts. They are often cracked, and that can lead to bigger problems down the road. It's an easy fix, but if you don't have a welder and if you're not handy with welding, that can be daunting, but you can find a shop that should be able to do that for you. The rest of this stuff, all the body bushings seem good, but all the rest of the bushings seem really, really bad. So that's what I would focus on, is replacing those bushings. If you are limited to a certain budget right now, don't worry about your leaf springs. No, they're not the best things you can get, but by swapping out these emulsion style for a monotube shock, you're gonna get a tremendous increase in performance and handling. Replacing the springs down the road would be a recommendation that I will make to this guy. Custom leaf springs are expensive. They do have a long lead time, but they're going to make the truck really, really drive well. Replacing all the bushings with correctly sized bushings is important too. And maybe a little bit of cleanup on the wiring, but I'm not too concerned with his wiring. My attention focuses on his steering and his suspension at this point. We'll get into the motor down the road if he wants to crack that thing open and maybe make a little bit more power. But to make it drive, perform, be safe, steering and suspension. Now, that's not taking into consideration roll cage and interior. If you have kids in the family and anyone's going to be going in the back, you need to have a roll cage. I mean, it's just common sense. DIY 4x makes a family-style cage that you can put in, and it's the way to go. You know, they need a roll cage. Don't be convinced that the roof is enough of a roll cage. It isn't. What else would I suggest to this guy? An electrical refresh to take a look at what electrical issues we have. I noticed that some of the turn signals weren't working and things like that, and the running lights were the wrong color. Everything else, I'm decently happy with. It's going to be a great little truck when we're done with it. It's going to perform well. It's going to have a great platform that he's going to be built on should he want to develop this thing down the road.
I have been a huge fan of Squarebodies for, man, going on 30 years now. I love these things. And so it's really cool for me to see other people recognizing their value and just how great they are to work on, to have as a runaround or a project vehicle. And I'm hoping that this video and subsequent videos I have coming up will show you some of the easy things you can do to these guys to make them perform less like a 40-year-old, 50-year-old truck and more like a modern vehicle. Simple, easy upgrades that add safety, performance, and reliability to your truck are always welcome at Merricks Garage. Please consider giving me a subscribe, the button down below, and I'm also going to link up here to a video on high steer and crossover. It's one of the first videos I ever did, but it's been incredibly popular, and it tells you all the different steering scenarios you might run into, and help you choose which one may work well for you.